responsiveness, okay? This model's responsiveness to analyzing the data that was originally set out from that first logic model, okay? So what we see here in logic model number 2 is that we see that now we have short-term and then we have intermediate and long-term. And so we have a longer process in which we're gauging that change over time, okay, and over status. We're helping families who are homeless or at risk, so their status is changing because they're coming to a spot where they're no longer in crisis or vulnerable, and they're now safe and stable and moving towards that, okay? So what we do see here is that with this more comprehensive approach, they've also adjusted what their outcomes or their outcome indicators are to realistically be able to address that long-term need as it relates to housing stability. So does anybody have some observations that you want to share about this?
They almost met long-term, and they did a lot better in the long-term because their goal was 15 of 50 secure public housing, 4 of 50 unsubsidized, and 1 of 50 purchase.
Yeah.
They got less secured public, but more unsubsidized rental, and they didn't get any purchased homes. But the total number of homes that they, or people that they actually helped was almost what their goal was. It was just a couple shy.
Yeah.
So it seems like they did a lot better of identifying ways to assist people long term.
Absolutely, targeting that.
Yeah.
And we also
I mean, what's
see
to
here.
say that so there is a significant drop in the percentage, but what's to say it's all bad?
Right.
It's probably more accurate, right?
It's probably more accurate.
It's probably
just,
more
it's more
accurate.
accurate.
Yeah.
It's more
It's
realistic
just
goal.
still sad.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just more realistic as far as
It's still.
the factors that are
It's-
involved.
And that's what we have to be, is we have to be realistic about the way that we set our targets. And that's what we have been, I mean, we've heard that over and over and over again, is that now with our new annual report, we have to make sure that we're targeting appropriately within that 80 to 120%. So the other thing that's really cool with this one is that you see that there's an expanded mission statement. So
I didn't
they've done some
notice that,
changes here that have really helped us with defining their scope
Permanent.
better. Yep, exactly. And so that really helps with, again, clarifying the intent and being that foundational piece that drives this logic model as it progresses forward. Okay?
So in total, 12.
Do we have questions about this part of it?
It's also interesting
27.
that they had so many more people involved
Yeah.
than they had projected to serve, which is how their money's all based off of, so, that's interesting, I think.
Provided to
Yeah.
50 families,
So there's a combination of better follow-up, collection of follow-up data, and analysis factors that were key in recognizing the original limitations, and now they've implemented that, and we're seeing better success reflected here and more realistic success.
Actually, on a percentage base, they matched it, number
matched
for
it?
number.
Match
It
what?
was just in different categories. So
Okay.
the 15 of 50, 12 of 65,
Okay.
4 of 50, 15 of 65,
Okay.
1 of 50, 0 of 65, comes out to 41% for both sides.
Isn't that interesting?
It was just put
Yeah.
into different,
It was
so they
just-
actually
yeah.
met 41% success rate.
Yeah,
It was just in different categories.
it was in
It's gotta
different
be rigged.
categories, yeah. So it's, the thing that we want to make sure is that we do these logic models. Every single program within community action has a logic model attached to it. So if you haven't looked at the logic model that dictates what your program does, then ask your supervisor to provide you with a copy of it, because this is something that's really, really helpful for us, because as, again, good practitioners who want to impact long-term change and be fiscally appropriate, we want to make sure that we're following those plans. Drucker reminds us that the plan gets done when we are informed, we're well-equipped, and we've been assigned roles within how this logic model operates. So
Sure.
that helps with that accountability piece, okay?
Wow.
So we are going to move forward right now. Page 108. Okay, we have another activity here. We're going to kind of cruise through this one because, again, we're running short on our time and we don't want to go long today. So in 108 here, we have this activity, so we need to review column number 1, the needs statement from this housing assessment. So again, just refer back to the logic model we've been working off of, and just take some housing conditions from that logic model and plug them into this outcome scale. So sometimes people ask, do we use an outcome scale or do we use a logic model? But that's kind of like asking, do you use a GPS or a gas gauge? I mean, they measure different things, okay? We want to make sure, but that we can also have that language. So does that make sense? So for example, with thriving, we're going to look back at this logic model, and I see on here that owning your own home ownership was listed. So that housing condition would go into the thriving category. So we're taking information from the logic model and we're putting that into our outcome scale. So let's just take like 2 minutes for this.
Emergency shelter. Oh, sorry.
Yep, exactly, emergency shelter, where would you put that, Sean? That's okay. So emergency shelter, what do you, yeah, you just wanted to point, it's,
It was in there, it
Yeah,
just
yeah.
popped out to me,
Okay.
guys, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Subsidized housing.
Public housing.
okay, so public housing, where would you put that,
unsubsidized
Lisa?
rental. Public housing, I'm so ignorant on this.
Okay,
Uh,
consider public housing?
so public housing is gonna be something that, it might be like tax credit housing, so.
But it's not
they
short
have-
term, right? It's
Yeah,
long
it's not
term.
short term.
But I guess it's stable.
Okay, I'd put that in stable.
Stable or safe?
Yep, yeah,
Yes.
I think stable or safe would be appropriate with that, so.
Probably depends where it is.
Yep, exactly, and that's exactly it, is that
Or what?
depending on the location, it could be different. So, how about, let's look at some of these other things that are on here. We see that in this second logic model, they do a better better job of defining places, and so we see public housing, we also see unsubsidized housing. Okay,
Sorry, so unsubsidized.
unsubsidized housing, where would you put that?
Well,
Unsubsidized
depending
rental.
on if you had enough money, it would be either
Is
vulnerable
it
or
maintainable,
safe.
or, yeah,
it could be in that
exactly.
range,
Yeah,
you know.
so that
If it's
could
not
be.
subsidized.
Is there a time?
So I would
Right.
say,
Those
you know,
subsidized have a,
Well, this one's unsubsidized.
I'd say safe, let's just say safe, because
Yeah.
people aren't going to, in the context of a program, they're not gonna transition into something that puts them from they're not gonna go from the frying pan into the fire. They're gonna move into something that gets them above that line, that prevention line, into a level of independence. So
What's
we're gonna
transitional?
say that they're gonna be
So
safe
like
and
they went through a property
unsubsidized.
management company and they assessed that they'd be at 30%
Exactly,
of their
yep, there's a
income for
screening
rent.
process
Yeah.
involved, 3 times the amount of income is what the rent is, so we're gonna assume, yeah. What about transitional housing?
Super safe for a short period of time,
Okay,
so vulnerable.
It felt vulnerable to me.
yeah, I'm
Don't get feeling safe.
vulnerable is probably safe, so.
What do you consider transitional housing?
So wait, you said
It's
safe or
transitional is
vulnerable?
housing that is time sensitive, so there's like, you can be in it for 2 years and then you have to leave, so it's to help, yeah, so.
That's kind of vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think that vulnerable is the appropriate spot for that. So, again, there's lots of different factors that go into this. We get to determine what the correct tool is. We can use this outcome scale as well as looking at some of these logic models and have some of that language go back and forth there. The outcome scale might be something that's helpful when you're working one-on-one with somebody, and this logic model might tell more of your program's overall story. So it's just good information to have.
Yep. Connection.
So, the outcome scale is comprised entirely of outcome statements placed on the framework, and so, and they just measure that incremental change, okay? So what we've done already is transfer all of that, so we've done that. We're gonna move over right now and kind of make a bridge, and that now that we have the number who have, you could also put the number of people who achieved each of these identified states on the scale, so you could put that on the scale is, the outcome scale. You can translate, again,
sure.
capture the information from here and plug it in there.
Who
So-
went from emergency to public to unsubsidized, you mean, and then measure that?
Yeah,
Those
exactly,
numbers.
exactly, and how that would relate to thriving to in crisis. So you would be able to, take
Right.
that information and kind of plug that in and translate some of that. So, On 109, we talk about doing some of the target setting and setting up targets. Okay, so we've discussed the need for creating projections or targets, and we've reviewed and established some of the recognized like performance standards like baseball. And so again, we, in the previous activity, did some follow-up. Once they had that logic model number 2, they had to do some follow-up to appropriately, identify what their target was going to be so that it was realistic. And we as a network have to make sure that we are realistic with the setting of our stuff. So the information from that activity reflects that data was actually collected by an adult education program. So in page 109, you see that they talk here about the number of people that were served, and it talks about the following program service outcome data for analysis. This is kind of an inverted outcome scale. So people at the, let's see here, so you can see here that 35% achieved competency. So at the bottom, that's the people that achieved, and then up at the top was the total amount that was there. So again, we have to be careful with the definition. It's an upside down format, so thriving was at the bottom and in crisis was at the top. But we have to be very careful with the way that we set our expectations for the programs that we have, and we target our efforts. So we want to make sure that we're doing that. So exactly how we are successful with using program service data to establish final outcomes and how those are achieved. And we as an agency are going to be realistic. We're going to use indicators that are really helpful in that process so that we can see what we expected and what we actually achieved, much like the way that baseball used those statistics. That way, if we have 35% success rate, we can be really, really proud that that's an appropriate target for us and the work that we're doing. So we're going to use our data to establish what those standards are so we know what success looks like. Okay, so we looked earlier today at a number of different modules as it related to adult basic education. Remember, we talked about those different examples as that was earlier in the process. And if you turn over to page 110, you'll see here that, again, we're going to review some of this. And this is just, again, an example for setting targets. And setting targets helps us be able to identify where we need to put our efforts. And so just take a second and review what that logic model looks like on page 110. See that in column 6, these are all the accountability measures that are there, and that they are there for both outputs in column 2 as well as outcome indicators from column 4. Are you tracking me and seeing where that is? So we see in column 6 how that stuff is integrated from column 2 and column number 4. Okay? Again, when we talked about these examples earlier today, there were 100 customers that were recruited, 95 were screened and placed, so we have some numbers that we're working with that were plugged into this. And it's just important to note that these measures that we're using right there in that column number 6 are both outputs and outcome indicators from 4, and that good management has to have a way to document and to track all of that, and so that we can report out on the data as it relates to both the services that we provide as well as the outcomes that we achieve. Sometimes we invest some capital into people and they drop out of the program, so we still want to be able to capture that somewhere. It's part of the story. Okay? So on page 111, we have an introduction to eLogic, and eLogic is a database that our agency has actually purchased and something that we've played with a lot. And these next 3 pages in your manual are just really, the purpose of them is to see that technology does have a place within the logic models, and it's really been helpful for us to be able to advance kind of what we're doing and step up our game in the way that we use these logic models. So we have this evolutionary process of moving from paper to databases, and in this electronic form with eLogic, you can have kind of an interactive logic model. And so so it's just an opportunity that exists there. It's not necessarily the right opportunity for everybody, but it's something that is helpful for a lot of different organizations and something that we've tinkered with a lot to try to get the most benefit from. Right now we have so many databases we enter information into, but again, they're all siloed information, okay? So there's a couple different examples of ways that we would do, you know, you could access some of those electronic databases or electronic systems to track our progress and to track the use of logic models. What I want to talk about quickly is just on page 115, what services produce outcomes, okay? And we are at the very end, guys, so we'll just see it through to the end. So this question is something that's being asked all throughout our network, and it's really difficult for us to be able to answer. We just have to see what is the most effective combination of services that's needed for a customer to achieve results. And remember when I got really excited because we got to talk about that holistic approach of bundling our services and thinking of that strategic thinking model, and I referenced that Annie E. Casey Foundation and what they had said, which is that bundling programs and sequencing services appropriately, so getting somebody into housing, getting LEAP in place, getting them you know, weatherization services, and getting them the employment and training that they need, that sequencing of those services helps with economic success and achievement for those we serve. So services are more likely, services will have a more than additive effect when we build off of all of that. We put these pieces together that help build with success. ENT is really good at doing that because, again, they do those initial assessments of how people are functioning and where they fall, and then they build off of those successes so that you can really pragmatically approach what an economic success looks like for somebody that we're serving. I think that it's important here that we look at, again, just those effective combinations, and that it's not just about multiple services being provided, but how these services are delivered in a comprehensive way. So that really rests on our shoulders. We have a lot of responsibility in this process to make sure that we're having some warm handoffs with the people that we're serving and connecting them within our departments so that they're getting what they need. And I think that we as an agency, our internal culture is switching a lot more towards that, of making sure that it's not just that you are in this program and you're also in this program, and you're also in this program. We're gonna help you navigate that process to make sure that the sequencing and the bundling of those services optimize your success. So it could be one of the key strengths of the CSBG funding stream, and it's flexible, this bundling of service, enough to provide an opportunity for a really comprehensive approach, which I think is just rad. I mean, I just think that's cool. So let's go through our final statements here, which we have learned that the logic model is being used by federal, state, and local funding sources. It can be used to support planning, monitoring, and evaluation, as well as management functions of the Community Action Network. It links program operations like 1 through 5. Remember 1 through 5 on our columns? I've lost our logic model. These are all things that report out on our operations, and then the remaining 3 columns are ones that report out on our accountability pieces, where we have to answer, have we been able to accomplish, and how we've been able to do that and prove with the documentation that isn't just self-report from clients, but hard evidence that shows we've been successful. The logic model can be used both to plan as well as to monitor implementation. Again, we have this assessment, planning, implementation, achievement of results, and evaluation. So we can use that logic model to evaluate whether or not our implementation has been successful and we've achieved the outcomes that we aim to achieve. It's kind of, the community action is developing a catalog of logic models that's been useful for accountability tools. Yeah, exactly.
That's a good
Remember
idea.
we talked about that before.
Not
Like,
reinventing.
don't reinvent the wheel. If we have a catalog of these, again, it's gonna help us with that universal
Yeah.
language so we can have those national level conversations. And there's data or technology that's available that can help us, and one of those models is eLogic. Cool? So we have, we've really concluded this part of our day. We have a couple things that I do just want to go back to. At the beginning of the day, you guys did the 10 questions. Remember that? At the very beginning, before page number 1, there was the 10 questions. That established our baseline knowledge. So if you revisit those 10 questions, I'm hoping that you'll see that you've had some incremental change throughout the course of the day that has defined your progress and that knowledge base. So again, we've done some assessment here of what your baseline knowledge was and what you're going to be walking with. Some other things that are important is that we have so many learning